Eastern Europe in the Middle Ages was a rather wild place we really don't hear enough about until the time of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Kievan Rus once dominated the region, before fragmenting and being subjugated by the Mongols. Across the Baltic continued a strip of pagan lands, against which the so-called Northern Crusades were called, where the Catholics violently Christianized the region. The way they did this, especially in the areas of Prussia, was through an extremely violent genocide, even for the time, which practically destroyed the entire native group and resettled the region with Germans. They were so successful in this that separating Prussian and German feels alien to us now, despite the Prussians once being a totally separate ethnic group. Besides the Teutons in Prussia, the Livonian order, in a more moderate way, subjugated most of modern-day Estonia and Latvia. Yet, there was one realm that survived the onslaught: Lithuania. While their neighbors were being conquered, the Duchy of Lithuania was actually rising, taking advantage of the weakening horde and their very loose control over these regions. Within a century, the duchy went from a minor pagan state on the fringes of Europe to quite literally the single largest European state. Now obviously, our Crusader states weren't on good terms with Lithuania, and for centuries there was consistent conflict between the two sides. The reasons for this should initially be clear. Lithuania was the next and arguably final target for the Catholic Crusades. All other surrounding states were either already conquered or already Orthodox. Beyond that, there were also some more secular reasons, mostly focused on the area of Samogitia, which the Crusaders really wanted to control to create a land bridge between the Teutonic and Livonian orders. Yet, the Crusades failed to make significant gains, despite large-scale back-and-forth raids and invasions. The border became increasingly entrenched as both sides began fortifying it. In fact, this very border was one of the longest-standing borders in European history, surviving unchanged for centuries until the aftermath of World War I. As the conflict dragged on, any hope for a true conquest of the duchy disappeared, and the conflict became much more generic, as Catholic Poland allied with pagan Lithuania against the growing power of the Teutons. This would further intensify with the rule of Władysław II Jagiello, who converted Lithuania to Catholicism, despite internal opposition. Even more, he would marry the Polish queen Jadwiga, thereby setting up both realms on the road towards their eventual unification. By this point, conflicts between the Teutons and Lithuanians would continue, but the hope for a full crusading victory had been dashed. The story then gradually comes to an end after the Battle of Grunwald. The Teutons had launched a major invasion into Poland, but were decisively crushed. In decades following, Teutonic power would decline as Poland-Lithuania established itself the definitive power bloc in the region. Eventually, another crushing defeat saw half of their territory seized by Poland, as the order officially became a vassal of the king. Afterwards, the Teutons stopped being a major player, as Poland started a battle for Eastern European supremacy with the Ottomans, Sweden, and the newly formed Russia, and much later on, also a latecomer in Prussia, which was formed from the very remnants of the Teutons. But what if all of this didn't happen? What if the Lithuanian Crusades were incredibly successful? As is customary for many medieval scenarios, it's not difficult to imagine just a few battles going differently, some disloyal vassals changing sides, a duke being killed in combat, and yes, Lithuania, much like Prussia and the Baltic before it, getting fully subsumed by the Crusaders. What happens if such a fundamental state to the history of Eastern Europe disappears fully? Before even diving into the specifics, we will have changed Europe forever. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth can never come to be. There is a gigantic amount of territory now up for grabs, ready for a power struggle between the Teutons, Tatars, Rus, and Poles. For Poland, their position against the Teutons has weakened significantly, perhaps putting their very rise into jeopardy. Over time, there is a very good chance that the Lithuanians suffer an extensive genocide, much like the Prussians before them, with significant German populations fluxing into these territories too, which, depending on how long Teutonic rule lasts, could permanently change the demographics of this region too. Could Lithuania become just as German as we now consider Prussia? It is very possible. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Also, I don't often do medieval scenarios, but I am considering doing more in the future. If you enjoy them too and want me to do more, let me know in the comments and give me some suggestions for medieval alternate histories. Now, I reckon we broadly split the scenario into two. In the first, we will have the Teutons take the position which Lithuania did in our timeline, which might look ridiculous on the map, but really wasn't that unlikely, as we will soon discuss. In fact, it might even be the more likely outcome. The other scenario we will discuss is one where the Teutons focus on their immediate Baltic holdings, refraining from other wild adventures. So, let's dive right into the first one, Big Teutonic Order. Let's take a look at Eastern Europe now that Lithuania has been erased. The Kievan Rus had become weak and divided before the Mongol conquests, but afterwards it had become even worse. The Tatar hordes started a purposeful divide and conquer approach. The major and wealthy Rus principalities, which might threaten their rule, were shunned, while relatively unimportant regions like Moscow were chosen to act as tax collector, delivering Rus tribute to the horde. The issue with this system is that when the Mongol Empire fell and the Golden Horde began declining in power, the Western Rus states became sitting ducks, which is part of the reason why the Lithuanians managed to seize that much land that quickly. There is little reason, in theory, why the Teutons wouldn't be able to do the same. Their victories in the Prussian and Lithuanian Crusades would have skyrocketed their prestige across Europe. And even if the Rus are already Orthodox Christian, it is unlikely to be all too controversial within Catholic Europe if the Teutons argue the continuation of their crusading against the Tatars and Orthodox in the east. Still, while I do think significant expansion is possible, if not likely, I do believe they'd have a worse time than the Lithuanian. Partially because the much larger focus on the religious aspect of their rule. After the conquest of Lithuania, a lot of effort and time would be spent in destroying the Lithuanian way of life and population. This already gives time for other powers to expand, while the Teutons are busy in Lithuania. Beyond that, as they expand, they'd have a much harsher stance on the Orthodox population centers. Yet, they cannot just replicate genocidal tactics in all of Ruthenia. The Teutons would need to spend a lot more effort keeping their territory under control, and we'd likely see a more powerful Poland in the west and a more stable horde in the south, as more of the Eastern Rus remain at least nominally independent. From here, a lot will depend on the inevitable Polish-Teutonic conflicts which will define the region. In these conflicts, in the longer term, the Poles are in my opinion the favored side. They have a far more coherent kingdom under their control, while the Teutons rely on being a Crusader state, practically without a crusade. Prestige from prior victories would wane over the centuries, and support from the rest of Europe starts to dry up. They will likely also be forced to rely greatly on Orthodox nobles, and their control will be fickle, open to Polish and Tatar destabilizations. On the other side of the border though, the Rus states likely won't be all too big of a threat for centuries, until they start to broadly unify, as they have to spend most of their time fighting each other and the Tatar hordes. Obviously, once a victor in the Rus is found, pressure on the Teutonic East will rise substantially, but before that point, the core conflict will be with the Poles. Now obviously, it is difficult to make grand predictions about history centuries out from this point, especially because it is a medieval scenario. and one random, unpredictable marriage could throw out all of my analysis. Still, I will broadly cover 3 potentials for the rest of this video. One where the Teutons come out on top, one where the Poles come out on top, and one where the Rus eventually benefit most in the long term. Now again, as I do think Poland is favored, let's discuss a world where they eventually overcome the Teutons. The first thing that becomes clear is that this struggle will be much harder. They are lacking a rather powerful alliance with the Lithuanians and are facing a significantly stronger order. But once the Poles do manage to wear down the Teutons, despite their empire looking roughly similar on the map, politically, the situation for Poland would be totally different. Rather than controlling Eastern Europe through a gigantic Duchy of Lithuania, a large array of semi-autonomous principalities and duchies would exist, aligning themselves to Poland. This is initially a benefit, as flipping disloyal vassals away from the Teutons would be a big advantage in their path to victory, but in the long term, this could easily be turned against them once competition with the Rus and the Ottomans play up. The Poles will have also spent much more energy actually gaining these lands, further weakening them even if they hold similar territories. Importantly, during the Teutonic Polish Wars, Scandinavia is likely not idle either, and we could easily imagine Denmark, or more likely Sweden, trying to establish themselves in the area too. As competition with Sweden, Russia and the Ottomans play up, Poland would be in a rough position compared to our timeline. And the main question would be, does their diplomacy evolve with the situation to save them? Which is, of course, very possible. Either way though, the period of Polish hegemony over Eastern Europe could be cut short dramatically, as they might be beset with enemies even after defeating the Teutons. Yet, we are leaving something very important out. Queen Jadwiga of Poland is very powerful, as having a single woman rule a kingdom gives them a lot of diplomatic power. Any heir of a major realm marrying this queen essentially lays the foundation for a future union, at least in the short term, which again in our timeline led to her marriage to the Lithuanian Duke. With Lithuania completely removed, that eliminates that candidate. Yet assuming Jadwiga still exists, we haven't removed her need for a husband. Whoever she is forced to marry has the potential to radically reshape the future of Europe. Now it is difficult to predict who this is, but she was betrothed to the heir of the Duchy of Austria, Duke Wilhelm of Habsburg. Now we know that the Habsburgs were set to one day become the Holy Roman Emperors, but the Poles didn't. So the Polish nobility rejected the marriage, seeking a more powerful alliance instead. Again, ending up with the Lithuanians in our timeline. Yet without Lithuania as an alternative, who else would even be there to marry? The Balkans are distant and relatively weak. The Rus are divided and relatively weak. Bohemia, Hungary and Brandenburg were under control of their enemies, and the Teutons were both an enemy and lacked a royal family. Within Eastern Europe, perhaps only a Scandinavian king offers a better alternative to Wilhelm von Habsburg. Should this marriage go through, it could have a lot of interesting potentials. Obviously a big one might be the full merger of the Duchy of Austria with the Kingdom of Poland. Though, the recalcitrance of Polish nobles probably prevents this. Still, even if the union later breaks, it would give the Habsburgs a claim on Poland in the same way as they later got on Hungary and Bohemia in our timeline. This means that there absolutely exist timelines where later down the line, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Bohemia and Hungary, and the Duke of Austria also vies for the Polish throne, creating the potential for some seriously overpowered Habsburg empires in Central and Eastern Europe. But, going back in time, what if the Teutons did come out on top? Again, I think the way we set up the nations makes this less likely, but it is a medieval alternate history. We can easily imagine the Teutons are bolstered by prior victories, and at some point managed to deliver a devastating victory against Poland. At various points, the Teutons attempted to press influence closer to the Vistula River. If they achieve this, their defensive position is greatly improved, while in the southeast, they might support a state like Galicia-Volhynia, largely neutering Poland as a short-term threat, allowing more consolidation to take place in the east. This could even eventually lead to a world where Poland and Russia become close allies rather than rivals, jointly opposing Teutonic hegemony over the region. By this point, who comes out on top in the longer term is even more difficult to say, except that I completely expect the rising Ottomans to perform even better against the Christians. Compared to Poland-Lithuania of our timeline, even in the best case, our alternate Poland would be weaker, and the Teutons of the 1500s would definitely lack the power to make a difference against the Turks. Worst case for the Catholics, the Ottomans might even capture Vienna, causing chaos in the HRE. But even more moderate scenarios could see the Ottomans solidifying Hungary, Galicia, and yet more of southern Ukraine. Now of course, there is a limit to Ottoman expansionism. Full conquests of Austria, Bohemia, or Poland would have always been extremely difficult. But even what we have set up now already means that once the Ottomans start to stagnate, their decline will be way slower, as the coalition that might form to oppose them would be even weaker and even more divided. Things like the Habsburg reconquest of Hungary might just be prevented, as the Ottomans entrench themselves deep into Ukraine. Now, in whichever of these scenarios, it is also near guaranteed that the Lithuanians practically go extinct. The Teutonic genocide would have been devastating on the local population, but even if they are later defeated, much of the damage will have already been done. Besides, the Poles, even in our timeline, massively settled in Lithuania too, which in this timeline would even further suppress their population. Perhaps Lithuania will truly become a twin of Prussia, becoming a vassal duchy of Poland, ruled by a German upper class, as we saw across various other regions in the Baltic too. The concept of Lithuania might not refer to a nation or a people, as it simply becomes a geographic and political expression. Then, when the Protestant Reformation takes hold, the future of whatever remains of the Teutons will be decided, if they are still around. Protestantism as a religion was nearly handcrafted to appeal to the German nobility and elites, and whether or not the Teutons follow suit is difficult to say, likely relying in great part on their relations with the Pope and the current emperor, both things nearly impossible to predict. Still, the Reformation might offer the best opportunity to try to reform their government into a more modern and coherent entity, which could be good for their long-term power. But of course, this is so far out, it is just heavy speculation. Now to conclude the video, let's go back even further. There is a very decent chance we don't see the Teutons expand like Lithuania did at all. Yes, those territories are easy pickings on paper, but again, decades are likely required to fully pacify Lithuania, as it took them around 50 years to do the same for Prussia. Minor raids might be launched to secure their position, but it is far from unthinkable that the Order simply consolidates their Baltic holdings and focuses primarily on their power competition with Poland. In such a world, the main winner would initially be the Tatars, who would continue to see a lot more Ruthenian territory remain under their yoke for longer, ensuring more tributes continues passing to the Horde. Initially, this would strengthen their position, potentially allowing them to keep the Rus under control for longer. Yet realistically, the Tatar yoke is unlikely to last forever, as their military and politics stagnate, while the Rus were gradually growing stronger under their very noses, makes it very likely that eventually the Rus outgrow the Horde, especially as a nomadic conqueror like Tamerlane devastated the Horde in our timeline. Then once the Golden Horde declines, and potentially even splits, the eventual big winners would be the Rus, who start acting increasingly independent from the Horde. In our timeline, it were the Muscovites who would unite the independent Rus through force and diplomacy. Now there is no guarantee that they would still manage to do so in this timeline, but the idea of a variety of increasingly powerful Rus principalities competing against each other, and then later the Tatars, is far from crazy. Muscovy is absolutely still a decent contender, starting out as a weak principality, allowing them to grow strong without horde intervention. But other solid options include Kiev, the historical capital of the Kievan Rus, though they do have to contend with Poland in the west. And exactly because of their historical power, the Tatars might act sooner if they do start to rise. Another personal favorite contender is the Duchy of Smolensk, which historically was destroyed by Lithuania, but might now be the main contender against a Muscovite rise to power. Now, if I am correct, and any Rus state manages to mostly unite the various principalities into a coherent role, the future of Eastern Europe will be completely changed. The foundation of Russia might not look like this, but instead starts out with everything from Kiev to Novgorod. Now, why does this matter for the long-term future of Europe? Well, we could end up with a Russia which from far earlier on reaches a position where they lack any peer competition due to the absence of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. After all, who else is there to confront them? Sure, Sweden would likely rise, but realistically, there is a hard limit on what they can conquer. Yes, they can cause serious trouble, but I seriously doubt Sweden's ability to subjugate or destroy Russia. Similarly, the Ottomans are always scary, but they likewise aren't going to just march on Moscow. At worst, they might complicate the Rus' position in southern Ukraine and the southern steppes. But regarding the Russian heartland, due to Teutonic and Polish infighting, I highly doubt any power would seriously threaten them. And it really feels as if the Rus are set up to completely dominate Eastern Europe centuries earlier. An alternate Rus empire, which borders Romania in the 1500s, is far from unrealistic. But it is terrifying. Perhaps in other periods or timelines, this might cause a panic across the Catholic world. But realistically, the time of crusades is way over, and the response to this gigantic Orthodox threat would likely be muted, especially because it would coincide with the Ottoman Empire rising, which presented a far more pressing threat on Catholic Europe, and it too failed to be contained by the Catholics. And between the two rising Eastern powers, the Ottomans would almost always have the priority. Again, if such a Rus empire does form, they might be far more likely to achieve Eastern European hegemony. Now, as an interesting side note, this earlier Rus unification could very possibly cause the independent identities of the Eastern Slavs to meld together more. Of course, major regional differences have existed for centuries before this point, but the various peoples being divided by various national borders across the centuries intensified those differences. An earlier unification could eventually cause those identities to become more uniform, which once more becomes a major boost to the long-term power of the Rus state. So, that is about all I have to say for this video. This little-known conflict on the outskirts of Europe, which went nowhere historically, had the potential to completely shake up the future of the continent. The specifics are difficult to tell, but it very likely favors the Ottomans, while in some scenarios leading to a completely hegemonic Rus empire, and in some niche cases, potentially even being the catalyst for a gigantic Habsburg empire. Now again, I don't often do medieval scenarios, so I do hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please show your support by liking and commenting, and I will be sure to do more in the future. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.